Daughter said I could have my own space. That was the exact phrase she used, your own space. And I was foolish enough to believe it meant something. I was 67 years old when I moved into her house. Retired, widowed 2 years prior, living alone in the same three-bedroom house in Columbus where I'd raised her and her brother for 30 years. The mortgage was paid off. I had my routine, my garden, my Tuesday morning book club at the library. I wasn't lonely, exactly. But after my husband Gerald passed, the quiet at night had a different texture to it. Heavy, the kind you feel in your chest. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is, though some days that word felt like a courtesy, had been after me for almost a year. Mom, it doesn't make sense for you to rattle around in that big house alone. We have the room. Think of how much you'd save on utilities. She and her husband had bought a 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb outside Cincinnati the year before. New construction, high ceilings, a finished basement, a backyard the kids barely used. Her husband was polite enough on the phone, not warm, but polite, the kind of polite that has a ceiling to it. I said yes in March. I told myself it was practical. I told myself I was being sensible, not sentimental. I gave up my book club, arranged to have my furniture put in storage, packed what I thought I'd need, and drove the 112 miles south in my 2019 Civic with a lemon tree cutting wrapped in wet newspaper in the passenger seat. My granddaughter was 4. My grandson had just turned 7. I had read to both of them over video calls for 2 years. I knew their stuffed animals by name. I thought, and I want you to understand, I genuinely thought this, that moving in would be good for all of us. The room they gave me was the 4th bedroom, at the end of the hall past the kids' bathroom. It was painted grey, a colour my daughter called slate, and I called the inside of a rain cloud, and had a window that faced the fence. There was no closet, only a wardrobe bed brought up from the basement that smelled faintly of something I couldn't identify. I set my lemon tree cutting on the windowsill and told myself the light would be fine. The first week, everything felt like a beginning. I made breakfast in the mornings. I walked my granddaughter to the bus stop. My daughter hugged me when she left for work and said, "I'm so glad you're here, Mom." I believed her. By the second week, the shape of things started to come clear. My son-in-law worked from home 3 days a week. On those days, he needed the house quiet by 9. Not quiet, but a particular kind of quiet that apparently included me. Not running the washing machine, not talking on the phone in the kitchen, and not having the news on even at low volume in my room. I found this out not from a conversation, but from a look. The specific look a person gives when they've decided you should already know something. My daughter mentioned it to me gently that evening. "He has calls all morning. You understand?" I said of course. I did understand. I moved my laundry to evenings. By the end of the first month, I had a list in my head, though I never wrote it down. No laundry before noon. Don't use the good towels in the hall bathroom. Those were for guests. Don't park in the left side of the garage because that was where my son-in-law liked to keep his equipment. Dinner was at 6:30, not 6, because 6 felt rushed to him. And the children, I was welcome to watch them any time, which meant I was expected to watch them most of the time. I want to be fair here. No one sat me down and handed me a schedule. It accumulated the way water damage does. Small seepages that you think you'll address and then don't. And then one day you press your hand against the wall and feel how soft it's become. I watched my grandchildren 4 days a week while my daughter worked. On the 5th day, she worked from home, but still. "Mum, could you just keep them occupied for a couple of hours?" I cooked dinner 3 nights a week, then 4, then most nights, because it turned out my son-in-law preferred home-cooked meals to the meal kit deliveries they'd been doing. And since I was there and didn't have anywhere to be, it only made sense. I vacuumed. I folded laundry, theirs, not just mine. I wiped down the baseboards because I'd noticed they were dusty, and it was the kind of thing that bothered me. I kept my mouth shut about the baseboards because I didn't want to seem critical of my daughter's housekeeping. I just cleaned them quietly and said nothing. My back had been bad since my late 50s. A compression at L4 and L5 that fled if I stood too long or lifted wrong. Gerald used to bring me the heating pad without being asked. He knew the signs. the way I'd shift my weight, the slight stiffness when I stood up from a chair. Here, no one noticed. Or if they noticed, they didn't mention it. In September, about 6 months in, I asked my daughter if we could talk about the childcare arrangement. Not to complain, I chose my words carefully, but to discuss. I told her my back was struggling with the lifting, the crouching at the kids' level, the hours on my feet. I said I was happy to help, but maybe not every single day. Maybe 3 days a week, I could have some time to rest. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. It was the look of someone doing math. I mean, Mom, she said, if you're not going to help with the kids, what's the arrangement here? I said I was helping. I was helping every day. I just needed 1 or 2 days to give my back a rest. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not agreeing, but they've decided to close the conversation. We'll figure it out, she said. 2 weeks later, my son-in-law mentioned at dinner in front of the children that the basement had been fully finished now and had a separate entrance, and that his brother had been looking at it as a possible rental, and that if I wasn't contributing in a way that offset the space I was taking up, it might be worth having a conversation about what made sense. He didn't look at me when he said it. He said it to the table, to no one in particular, the way you'd mentioned that the gutters needed cleaning. I put down my fork. My granddaughter was telling me something about a drawing she'd made at school. I turned to her and asked her to tell me more about it. I listened to the whole thing. I did not respond to what my son-in-law had said, because I didn't trust what would come out of my mouth. That night I lay in my grey room and looked at the ceiling and thought about the word contributing. I thought about the 4 days a week of childcare, which, if I looked at the average rate for a nanny in the Cincinnati metro area, which I did on my phone at 11:15 at night, ran somewhere between $16 and $22 an hour. I thought about the dinners. I thought about the laundry. I thought about the baseboards. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, my daughter came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and said, "He didn't mean it the way it sounded." I said I understood. She poured herself a cup and left for work. I stood at the counter and thought, this is the moment. This is exactly the kind of moment that, if you let it pass, becomes permission. But I let it pass. That's the honest truth of it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I let it pass because she was my daughter, and I loved her, and because some part of me still believed that if I was patient and kind and useful enough, the version of her I'd raised would reassert itself. I stayed. Through October and into November, I stayed. I watched the children. I cooked. I moved carefully around the house, learning its rules the way you learn a language you never chose to study. Don't leave personal items on the kitchen counter. The counter was for the family. Don't have guests over without asking first. The house had a flow to it that visitors disrupted. Don't leave the TV on in my room past 9 because the sound carried. I called my friend Helen in Columbus every Sunday. She'd been my neighbor for 20 years. She'd stood next to me at Gerald's funeral and not tried to say the right thing, which was the kindest possible thing she could have done. She listened to me on those Sundays and didn't say I told you so, though she was entitled to. She'd told me gently before I moved that it was worth thinking through. You can always come back, she said one Sunday in November. Your house is still there. The Martins are renting it, but a lease ends. I told her I was fine. I wasn't fine. In late November, I slipped on the wet tile of the kids' bathroom while getting my grandson a towel during his bath. I didn't fall, but I wrenched my lower back, catching myself, and the pain that followed was the sharpest I'd had in years. I spent 2 days barely able to stand without gripping something. My daughter brought me ibuprofen and a heating pad and seemed genuinely worried, and for those 2 days I felt the tenderness I'd been looking for all those months. She sat on the edge of my bed, and we talked, really talked, about her father, about how much she missed him, about how the house sometimes felt like too much. It was the most real she'd been with me since I'd arrived. On the third day, when I was still moving carefully, she said, "Mom, I really need you to watch the kids this afternoon. My sitter cancelled, and I have a client call I can't move." I looked at her. She looked back. "I know you're back," she said, "but they're pretty self-sufficient. You'd mostly just be there. I watch the kids. I spend 40 minutes on my feet in the kitchen getting them a snack and cleaning up after because leaving a mess bothered me, and by evening the wrenching pain had settled back in with the particular cruelty of pain that has been interrupted and resumed. That night, something shifted in me, not dramatically, not with tears or a revelation, just a quiet rearrangement of something internal, like furniture being moved a few inches, enough that the room felt different even if you couldn't point to why. I started paying attention to things I'd been avoiding. I looked at my bank account, which I had not depleted, but also had not added to, living off my social security and the small pension from 30 years as an office manager for an accounting firm. I was not in trouble, but I was not getting younger. And the money I'd imagined saving by not paying rent had been absorbed by things I didn't quite track: extra groceries I bought, gifts for the children, small expenses I took on without being asked, because it seemed like the right thing to do. I called the management company that rented my house in Columbus. The lease ended in February. They asked if I was interested in renewing or reclaiming. I said I needed a few weeks to decide. December came. My daughter put up Christmas decorations the weekend after Thanksgiving, and it was genuinely beautiful. The house was warm and bright and smelled like the pine candles she loved. I wrapped presents at the kitchen table and helped the kids decorate cookies and felt, for several days, like the story I told myself when I moved in might still be true. Christmas Eve, both families came, my son-in-law's parents and his sister and her husband, and my son drove down from Cleveland with his girlfriend. It was loud and full, and the children were delirious with excitement. I cooked the brisket I'd been making for 40 years, the one Gerald had always requested on holidays, and my daughter's mother-in-law asked me for the recipe, and for a few hours I was simply a grandmother at Christmas and not a woman calculating her options. The day after Christmas, my son-in-law's parents were still there. His mother had slept in my room. I'd been moved, quietly by arrangement without being asked, to an air mattress in the sewing room off the master. It was presented as just for the holiday, but I noticed that my things had been moved with a thoroughness that suggested it wasn't an impulsive decision. My lemon tree cutting, which had grown into something modest but alive, was on the floor of the sewing room next to a box of fabric scraps. I didn't say anything. It was Christmas. His parents left on the 27th. I moved back to my room and put the lemon tree back on the windowsill. I sat on my bed for a while and looked at the fence and thought about my house in Columbus, about the kitchen with the yellow walls I'd painted myself the summer before my daughter was born, about the garden where I'd grown tomatoes every year for 20 years, about my own bed, my own curtains, the drawer where I kept Gerald's things. On January 3rd, I called Helen. "I think I'm coming home," I said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'll get the guest room ready until you can get back into your place. I want to tell you about the night I left because I've thought about it many times since, and I still don't regret a single part of it." It was a Thursday in late January, cold, a few inches of snow on the ground from 2 days before. The children were in bed. My son-in-law was watching something in the living room. My daughter had fallen asleep on the couch. She did that sometimes, exhausted by 7:30 and out before the kids. I had spent the day folding laundry, supervising homework, defrosting chicken, making dinner, and loading the dishwasher, and my back had been speaking to me in the particular vocabulary of a body that has been asked to do too much for too long. I went to my room and I packed quietly, not frantically. I'd been packing in stages for 3 weeks, moving things to my car a little at a time. Books, the photo albums, Gerald's watch, the lemon tree, which I'd wrapped carefully in a plastic bag to protect it from the cold. I was methodical about it, the way you are when you've made a decision that's clear. The suitcase I packed that night had what I needed for a week at Helen's. The rest could wait. I wrote a note. It took me 4 drafts. The final version said that I loved her, that I hoped she understood, and that I had realized I needed to be somewhere I wasn't occupying space under conditions, and I used that word deliberately, conditions, that were making me smaller than I was. I said I'd call in the morning. I left it on the kitchen counter where it wouldn't be missed. I picked up my purse and my suitcase. I had my own key. They'd given me one when I moved in, a small thing I'd been grateful for, and I let myself out the front door at 11:47 at night and stood on the porch for a moment in the January cold. The snow on the driveway was undisturbed. The street lights made it glow faintly blue. My breath hung in the air. I walked to my car, put the suitcase in the trunk, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. I thought about the people asleep in that warm, bright house. I thought about my granddaughter's drawings on the refrigerator. I thought about my grandson's laugh, which sounded exactly the way my daughter's used to at his age. I would still be their grandmother. That wouldn't change. But I was also a woman who had spent 40 years of her life managing other people's needs with competence and grace, who had buried a husband and kept herself whole, who had a yellow kitchen and a garden and a book club on Tuesday mornings. And none of that had ceased to be true simply because I had been inconvenient enough to have a back that hurt. I started the car, the heater came on. The 112 miles north took me just under 2 hours on quiet winter highways. Helen had left her porch light on. My daughter called at 7 in the morning. I answered. There was a silence on the line, and then she said, "Mom, I didn't know you were that unhappy." I thought about all the ways I could respond to that, about all the moments she could have known had she wanted to, about the fork I'd put down in October and never quite picked back up. I said, "I know, honey, I know you didn't." We talked for a long time that morning. Some of it was hard. She cried. I didn't. Not on the phone. I'd done that already on the drive somewhere around Dayton with the highway empty in both directions and Patsy Cline on the radio because that's what Gerald always played on long drives. I moved back into my house in Columbus in February when the lease ended. The management company had repainted one of the bedrooms without asking, a beige I would eventually cover with the yellow I mixed myself, standing on a stepladder on a Saturday morning in April with the windows open and birds doing their business in the garden below. My lemon tree is in that window now. It has 5 leaves and 1 small branch, and I talk to it occasionally, which is not something I would have told you about before, but this is my story, and I've decided to be honest. My daughter and I talk on the phone twice a week. She came to visit in March with the children, just her, and we sat at my kitchen table and drank coffee and watched my grandson eat an entire sleeve of crackers without pause. And something between us was easier than it had been in a long time. Not fixed, exactly, but honest, which is better. She hasn't asked me to move back in. I haven't offered. I go to book club on Tuesday mornings. I grow tomatoes. On Sunday evenings, I call Helen and we talk until one of us gets tired, which is usually her, because she keeps a sensible schedule. And I have started staying up later than I used to, reading or just sitting in my own living room in my own quiet, which has a different texture now. Gerald is still gone. That hasn't changed and won't. But I am still here, and I am still whole, and I go to sleep at night in my own house under my own roof, having made my own choices. And I want you to hear this clearly. If you're listening, you are not required to make yourself small to justify your place in someone's life. You raised your children. You loved them well. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to take up space, not their space, not space that needs justification or negotiation, but your own, wherever that is. Whoever that looks like. You are not a solution to someone else's problem. You are a person, and it is not too late to live like one. I think about the night I left a lot, not with regret, I want to be clear about that, but the way you turn a smooth stone over in your hand, not to examine it, just to feel the weight of it again. What I understand now, looking back, is that nothing that happened in that house was sudden. It never is. The way my daughter came to see me as a function rather than a person, that didn't happen overnight. And if I'm honest, the way I allowed it to happen didn't either. Every time I stayed quiet when I should have spoken, every time I told myself, it's fine, she's tired, she has a lot on her plate, I was teaching her something. I was teaching her that my limits didn't exist, that my needs were negotiable, that I was available in the way that a light switch is available, always on if you press it. That's not her fault entirely. That's on me too. and I've had to sit with that. There's something I've come to believe about the choices we make over a lifetime, and it's this: they compound, the small ones especially. A woman who spends 40 years putting her own discomfort last doesn't arrive at 67 with a strong sense of her own worth just because she wants to. She has to choose it, deliberately, the way you choose to learn something hard. It takes a kind of honesty that doesn't come easy. The honesty to look at your own life and say, I have been settling. I have been calling it love when some of it was fear. When I left that house in January, it wasn't brave in the dramatic sense. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't deliver a speech. I just packed a suitcase, wrote 4 drafts of a note, and walked out into the cold. What made it possible was something I'd been building without knowing it: the slow accumulation of clarity. Every morning I'd spent in that grey room running the math in my head. Every Sunday call with Helen, where I'd said I'm fine and she'd waited a beat too long before moving on. The night I slipped on the tile and my daughter looked at me with that familiar calculation. All of it adding up. I think what my daughter lacked, and I say this not to condemn her because I love her and she is learning, was the ability to see another person's reality as real. Not just real in the abstract, but real in the way that changes your behavior. Her children were real to her. Her husband's preferences were real to her. My back pain was an inconvenience to be managed. That's not wisdom, and wisdom is something you can only develop if someone in your life tells you the truth. I should have told her the truth sooner. That's my part in it. What carried me through, in the end, wasn't anger. Anger burns fast and leaves you cold. What carried me was something quieter, a refusal to disappear. The understanding that I had earned my life, that the 30 years I'd spent raising children, managing a household, working full-time, caring for a husband through his illness, none of that obligated me to spend my remaining years as a live-in resource. I had done the work, I deserved the rest, and choosing that, walking toward it in the snow at midnight, was the most clear-eyed thing I had done in years. I'm back in my yellow kitchen now. The tomatoes are coming in. Helen comes for coffee on Fridays. Some things you have to lose before you understand what they're worth. I almost lost myself trying to hold on to a version of my family that only existed if I never asked for anything. What I found instead, my own life, my own ground, my own unhurried mornings, turned out to be worth more than I'd let myself remember.